enjoyed a chance to chat with one another at your various tables. We're now moving on to session one, which is navigating the COVID-19 disruption panel discussion. That will be moderated by Dr. Kevin McCaig. Kevin holds the Canada Research Chair in Social Enterprise and Inclusive Markets. He's also an associate professor here at CBU of Entrepreneurship and Strategy at the Shannon School of Business. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Victoria, Erica, and Megan for those presentations. Thank you for sharing your experiences in your organizations. That was really insightful and some common themes there. If I can just invite you to turn your cameras and mics on, Victoria, Erica, and Megan. And while you're doing that, I'll just note that unfortunately, you may have noticed that Kevin Rose was not able to join us today due to some, I believe, some health issues. So best wishes to Kevin, and hope he's able to be with us again in the future sometime. So thanks again, everyone, for your presentations. I was wondering about a few things as I listened to your experiences of your organizations, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on as as we lived through the pandemic, and as you were focusing on your members. To what extent do you think, and also thinking about the keynote presentation about equity and diversity, and to what extent do you think the pandemic really affected equity and affected people differently, and probably created more challenges for some people? What was the impact on equity, and especially on those perhaps with less resources to cope than others? I'd be interested in your thoughts, what you saw amongst your membership and amongst the broader communities. Maybe I can go around the room. Maybe Victoria, start with you. What did you see?
I saw, kind of like everything else with cooperatives, kind of a variety of impacts from some organizations that have been really focused on equity and diversity and inclusion and truth and reconciliation, having to scale back some of their initiatives as their own resources were compromised and lessened, with less revenue, less able to be able to contribute to community programming and less community initiatives happening, as lots of it went online and there wasn't the expenses of events as there has been when we have in-person events. At the same time, I did see also a lot of people, really, and cooperatives being really committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I think, folks from marginalized communities already typically have additional barriers. As Megan mentioned, who's participating in programming on a regular basis. So, those additional challenges of transportation or childcare, because some of those services were shut down or more inaccessible. So in some cases, for sure, there were less people able to make it to work or to programming, and being able to have the, as Megan mentioned in her presentation, the technology capacity to participate remotely is sometimes really challenged too. So I'd say it's kind of a mixed bag, but lots of examples of it being more challenging for people to participate.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Greater needs, which then then mobilized greater responses from your organization as well. Thank you. Erica, what did you see in terms of pandemic's effects on people, especially perhaps some of the most vulnerable?
Yeah, I think throughout, and as we find ourselves kind of coming out the other end of this, one of the, I think, consistent national and local conversations has been that this pandemic has had different effects on different populations. And so I think, for us, one of the interesting early realizations was how many of those that we serve pre-pandemic were already surviving entirely or in part on some form of government assistance. And so where we expected, for example, as a housing provider, we had expected to see a lot more requests for rent relief or abatement. And that didn't come, because so many of the people we house already count some form of government income as their main source of income. And so that was sort of a bit of an awakening for us. We serve a lot of seniors who were rendered even more vulnerable, the elderly, by the nature of this virus. I think we were surprised, and we shouldn't have been. This is the world we live in every day, but by the number of people who were 1 or 2 paychecks away from needing to use a food bank to provide some or all of their families' sustenance. And it is in our community tens of thousands of people who through the pandemic had to turn to food banks for the first time, or some other way of providing food for their families. And I think we have people who, I think probably all of us, had fairly secure employment and employment that could transition to home, and didn't feel that our day-to-day work put our personal health and safety on the line, or for whom the pandemic meant that there was no more work. And so here, that's been very much a part of the pandemic for a lot of people. So I think we couldn't possibly have more different experiences of what this has been like. And lastly, I'll say it was 2 things. Where part of our work is immigration settlement, and so we had hundreds of people, international students, international graduates, non-student graduate newcomers, whose pathway to immigration was suddenly on hold for an indefinite period of time. So talk about a life-changing, jarring uncertainty, not only about what the next few weeks was going to hold for them, but about what the next few years was going to hold for them. And there was just this period of time where locally, nationally, internationally, there were just no answers, because no one knew how long this was going to go on for, to what extent international travel and visa offices were going to close down. So a type of uncertainty around their livelihood, their families' reunification, that I just can't imagine. And then the last thing I'll say, and I touched on this in my comments, but for me, 2020, 2021, definitely defined by COVID, but also defined by these conversations about racism, systemic racism, racial violence, racial justice, that we have not had, that we've refused to have until this particular point in time. And so that has been part of our experience of these last 2 years as well.
Thank you, Erica. And from your perspective in Alberta, what's your overall kind of take on how the pandemic affected individuals, and especially, of course, with the immigrants and newcomers that you deal with? How did you see those impacts on your individuals you serve, and especially the most vulnerable?
Well, I think one of the things that you had said, Erica, that really hit home for me is that even amongst our close circles within our own organizations, the experience of the pandemic hasn't been universal. Everybody's experience has been their own. And that was something we really saw. And equity has shone through in almost every aspect of responding to this pandemic. I've been trying to organize how to address this, but starting with things like, for instance, the decisions to close schools and send kids home for virtual school. The inequities in that were astounding. And when you think about particularly larger families, low-income families, if you've got 3 kids, 4 kids, how many devices do you have in your house to start with where your kids can go to school? What if you're working? What if you need that device to keep your family income coming in? Do you have high-speed internet? Do you have a quiet place where somebody can actually listen to a teacher? So it was, for many people, the experience of education this year was highly inequitable. The decision was made based on the assumption that everybody's got a device for every kid who might be going to school, and that's coming from a place of real privilege. So that was one of the inequities that we tried to address, but certainly couldn't. And food insecurity was a surprise for us, and for many of the people we serve now and never served before. There were a number of people who were always able to make ends meet until this past year and found themselves for the first time needing services like ours. And the issues of pride getting in the way of supporting themselves and the people they support, and how do we make people feel like there is dignity in asking for this help and support, and that so there was a lot of personal touch that was needed to help people get through this, not just the transaction piece, but also just the emotional piece of helping people walk a new path. And the flip side of the inequities has been that being virtual has created a more equitable environment for a number of people, particularly those with disabilities who have been left out in many cases, and suddenly now they can participate in a different and more meaningful way. And that's been really wonderful for us to see. Particularly in our case, as soon as we were able to support people with their digital literacy, we had so many more people who were kind of confined to their homes even before the pandemic. Now they're reaching out, forming community, making connections, and learning, with digital literacy, an employable skill along the way. So that's been an advantage. The other side of the equity story, Erica's already touched on, and that is the many issues that we're facing with racial injustice and social justice issues. And as an immigrant agency, we have always been involved in this conversation. As part of the C5, we work really closely with other agencies in our community that whose community base is predominantly Indigenous, or they serve people who are experiencing homelessness. So we have a lot of different inroads, not just with the newcomer community. And trying to find a way to have, to use a specific example, Canada Day, trying to find that balance between a newcomer's joy, just pride and elation to become a Canadian citizen, contrasted against these horrific, confirmations of mass graves from, the residential schools, and really grappling with what does the Truth and Reconciliation Commission mean? Why that we have this in Canada? What does it mean for our story as Canadians? And telling newcomers the truth about Canada without taking one side or another, that, it's not bad, it's not good, this is what's real. So those have been really interesting and difficult conversations, and they have been eye-opening for many of the people in our staff, newcomers and Canadian-born alike. So that's been really, I think, a positive that's come out of all the negative stories.
Fantastic. Thank you, Meg. And I will invite any of our participants, if they have questions or comments, to share those in the chat. And we'll be watching that and happy to bring those into the conversation. I also was wondering about your thoughts from all of you about what you think will be some of the lasting impacts of the pandemic. So many changes have been mentioned in terms of how you do your own work, in terms of the how people have adjusted their lives. As we kind of, we heard about Megan, opening, Alberta now fully open, and so what do you imagine might be some of the lasting changes to your organizations, and perhaps the way you deal with your members and the beneficiaries you serve? Maybe Victoria, we'll start with you again.
Sure. I think there will be lots of impacts and kind of ongoing legacies of this past year and a half. I think definitely there will be more, it'll be more commonplace that we stick with kind of online events and interaction, or at least a hybrid where there's an option to participate online. We've seen that it's possible. And as you know, I think Erica talked about, you know, there was that acceleration of picking up kind of technology and moving to online, that there, you know, as everyone's mentioned, there's been some benefits to that. So I think that we'll all be a lot more open to that, although I think also people will want to go back to some in-person interaction as well. And I think, well, I hope that some of the kind of socialized, you know, wearing masks, being less up with each other's germs and close together, at least some of the time, or in public spaces, that it'll be a little more normalized for people to, you know, if they want to wear a mask, wear a mask. I mean, I've seen in Saskatchewan, our restrictions are lifted this coming weekend, but already I see, you know, people not wearing masks and stuff. So of course people want to get back to normal, but hopefully also there will be some understanding that everyone is in a different experience. You know, immune compromised people are people that just are more cautious, you know, being more accepted of like wearing masks or whatever they want to do, whether that is working from home. So I think we'll definitely see some hybrid working environments too, where some people might not come back or come back part of the time. But hopefully as some, you know, additional childcare, after school, before school programming picks back up and that kind of thing, we'll see also some more, you know, working towards more equity and you know, getting back at least to where we were in terms of workforce and people being able to participate. And hopefully this has made us all realize that there is a lot of work to do, whether it is on equity or involvement and representation of diverse groups, marginalized folks. So I hope that everyone will keep that in mind and take some tangible action to create better organizations and workplaces.
Great, thanks, Victoria. Erica, what are your thoughts in terms of potential lasting impacts on of COVID on your organization, on the way you work with beneficiaries, and or on, you know, the community members that you serve?
Yeah, and I think Megan, you touched on this. Right now, there are a lot of people who are really tired, and so I think when we think about this summer, we are really hoping that people can find the time and space in their personal and professional lives to catch their breath, to exhale, to take care of themselves. I think that's the first thing as an organization that we're trying to be really explicit about attending to. And so even though in Cape Breton we've had relatively low case numbers, there has been this collective breath holding, and whether or not, you know, as individuals, we're acknowledging it, it's been heavy to carry. And so I think first and foremost is that need for everyone to take care of themselves. In terms of lasting implications, I think, you know, so Nudon has been around since 1976, and since 1976 has been saying there may be a third way here in terms of how we meet our needs as communities that is not entirely driven by government mandates and policies, and that is not entirely driven by the private sector. And in 1976, that could take hours to explain to a group of people that you were meeting with. And over time, as this notion of social enterprise itself has become more socialized and understood and practiced, it's become easier to explain to people in 5 minutes what Nudon is and why it works in this way. And I think COVID-19 has also challenged the necessity and the benefits of capitalism. And so I think as we come out of this over the next decade, we'll find more people talking about doing things in that third way that keeps the benefit of communities at the forefront, while attending to that necessity of generating revenue to keep our operations intact. I hope that after the experience of the CERB and seeing how many of our fellow community members either live every day below the poverty line or live very, very close, 1 or 2 paychecks away from poverty, that we do move towards some sort of universal basic income, some level below which in the future, in experiences like these, we can ensure that people don't fall, that there is sufficient income to have. Megan, you were talking about, dignity and choice in the provision of food for people who are in need, and a sufficient level of income would really make sure that dignity is something that all Canadians have at all times through experiences like these. I think those bigger questions and those bigger issues are, for us, the ones that have a lot more, energy than those kind of, practical adaptations, which are lovely, and I think move us in a good direction in terms of autonomy and flexibility and personal choice.
Thank you so much, Erica. Megan, what's your perspective on the what you see as the potential lasting impacts of the pandemic on your organization, the way you serve your beneficiaries or your beneficiaries themselves?
Well, there are a lot of practical adaptations we'll keep. I think we're all aware of what's been working well, and I won't dive into that. But the two things that stand out for me that I am happy about and excited about are, for one thing, it, I think, has shifted finally out of that kind of, post-World Wars mentality of it doesn't matter if I'm at death's door, I shall drag myself to work, I shall be there, which is very self-focused, to opening that in a different direction, saying, if I'm sick, two things are true here. One, I'm not at my best, so let's get better so I can be at my best. And two, if I show up sick, I impact others. And I think that's really, in our organization, I've seen a real shift where people used to say, I have to get to work, I have to do it. What I do matters, I have to be there to do my job, to trusting their colleagues to pick up the ball if they have to set it down. And I would love to see this at a societal level where people are really just taking care of themselves, because, that old adage of put on your own oxygen mask first, it's something that we've come to realize during the pandemic. Our own ability to fight off an infection might be strong, but that doesn't mean that the person we encounter will have that same experience. And I think people are much more aware of that now. The other thing that I've loved is, using the words of one of my teammates, what we thought was impossible wasn't, as soon as we gave it a shot. And I think that we've all had a chance to really take off the, we've always done it this way hat, or that seems too hard, we're not going to try, and really take some of those experimental risks with things. And I look forward to that carrying onwards.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Megan. I wanted to pick up and invite anyone listening to please share questions or comments in the chat. But I think, Erica, you mentioned something I wanted to try to pick up on, and this question of, what impact maybe did the pandemic have on the social sector more broadly? I think we've heard about how your organizations are working very closely with your community members, how the needs were there, your organizations have responded very quickly and flexibly and with a lot of resilience. How do you, like, what do you think coming out of the pandemic is that kind of response going to be seen more broadly? You know, Erica talked about, you know, the social sector organizations being different than government, being different than the private sector. You know, the pandemic, I think, is really has really possibly shaken up the way people trust these different sectors or look to these different sectors for solutions. I'd be interested in your thoughts and what you think about how people will perceive the social sector more broadly, or perhaps just your own organization individually going forward in terms of trust and you know, will the social sector be looked to even in more kind of you know, needed in a greater way post pandemic? So Victoria, would you like to take a start with that?
Yeah, I mean, we work with a diversity of organizations. So some are more focused on social, some less. But yeah, I think it's for a lot of organizations with less of a diversified or strong revenue base, this has been really devastating for a lot of them. So for those that survive, I hope that it will be impetus to push to create, you know, reserves, and to push, like lots of times with government funding, it's difficult to, you know, cover core operating costs or to, you know, be able to put funds aside, or on occasion there's questions about like what you know, do reserve funds need to be there even. So I hope that this will help everyone realize that we all, I mean, whether it's personally or with organizations, we need to have that safety net to be able to get through tough times when the money that is normally there isn't there. And, you know, as we heard, you know, programs like CERB and, you know, on the organizational side, like the CEBA loans and the wage subsidies and all of those things have really sort of masked some of the what would have been really devastating personally and professionally for folks if those funds hadn't been there. So I think this also kind of reiterates the need for kind of government support and programming. I mean, yes, was expensive and will take us all collectively as taxpayers decades, I'm sure, to pay off, but also, you know, it did hopefully have a positive impact in terms of keeping more people in housing and you know, able to survive this, although obviously it didn't catch everyone because we did see lots of food insecurity and increased food bank usage and stuff. So so yeah, I think social program wise, I think again we'll see sort of more online activities and hopefully, you know, more access to people. Yeah, that's all that comes to mind right now.
Thank you. Erica, your thoughts more generally on how the social sector may be perceived more generally going forward, or organizations like your own?
Yeah, I think throughout the pandemic, as Victoria was touching on, I think the social sector played a role in addressing really immediate survival needs for people, whether that was housing or food or healthcare, mental health care. And I think at the same time, the social sector does play a role in you know, hosting and providing for things like arts and culture and community gathering, and that part of our life that brings great richness and meaning and purpose. And I would suspect that, yeah, we are all a bit more aware of the importance, the role, the necessity of the social sector. I think that certainly the federal government, when the implications of the pandemic started to become understood, made it a priority to keep people healthy and keep people at home. And so they provided the CERB as one means of enabling that. And they did, through the pandemic, both federal government and provincial government. Our experience was one of increased support to social sector organizations to help them meet more community need and fill greater community gaps. And it was surprising to see the speed at which resources could be deployed and the spirit of trust in which they could be deployed. And so for the first time, in my experience with a number of different government departments, we weren't looked on with suspicion and mistrust. We were, out of necessity, considered to be partners who could deliver needed services on the ground. And so I do hope that that is a legacy of this experience, that organizations can be trusted, resources can be deployed quickly, while also being deployed responsibly, so that the social sector can respond as the community needs dictate, and not 6 or 12 or 18 months after the need is first identified.
Thanks, Erica. Megan, anything in addition to add in terms of how the social sector more broadly may have been, their role might have shifted, or perceptions may have changed as a result of the pandemic?
I'm going to pick up a little bit on what you were saying, Erica. I think that the trust and the speed at which we were able to get the resources from government as well as foundation funders to just do the work we already know how to do best. That's something that I hope will carry through. I have a weird little job on the side. I'm the co-chair of the red tape reduction panel for the nonprofit sector here in Alberta. And that's something that we've been really trying to drive home is we know what we're doing and we do it well. We should be accountable, absolutely. But if you will just trust us to do it and to know how to use the money you give us, we can do a lot more with it rather than pay a lot of our staff to just report back to you what we're doing with the money. So this would be a good legacy to keep. The other piece is the community partnerships. They were much easier to forge because we had more flexibility in our funding. And so when we were going to funders saying, we're working with this agency, this one, and this one for this project, they said, great, go do it. And we did. And we found ways to work together and collaborate that had not been easily possible before. So I would love to see that change stick around as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And thanks to those of you who put questions in the chat. I'm going to go to one of them now. I think AJ Fraser asks, have your organizations thought about future services and initiatives, based on your experiences in the last year plus? So I think that's a great question. Thanks, AJ. Victoria, how about you? Have you thought about new initiatives?
We have a little bit. We have strategic planning planned for this fall, so we'll be kind of focusing more on it then as we look forward over the next few years, and also have a couple of months post restrictions being lifted to see where we're at. But definitely I've already personally been thinking about, increasing our, webinars and online events and that kind of thing. But yeah, we haven't done too much yet because we will be returning to our regular in-person programming as well, because we do a lot of in-person events too. So yeah, just a little bit so far.
Fantastic, thank you. And just, we have about 3 more minutes left. So this might be a good question to end on with Erica and then Megan. So Erica, has your organization thought about new initiatives, new programs to launch?
Yeah, our work in food security throughout the pandemic has grown. So both this awareness, and I think Alicia Lake, one of the panelists following us, will touch on this, but As an island, our recognition of how vulnerable we are in terms of food provision for those who can afford to go to grocery stores and buy what they like. We don't produce much of our own food here on Cape Breton, and when supply chains and transportation and factories and farms across the world become threatened, we're quite powerless. And so I think both in terms of local food production and wanting and needing to do more work to address root causes of household food insecurity, that will be one of the areas of work coming out of the pandemic that we're much more involved in. And I think the second, and so this this predated COVID a bit, but COVID has really increased our involvement and interest in the issue of addictions in our communities. And so we have here disproportionately high levels of alcohol and drug addiction in Cape Breton. And we know that COVID has not made that any better. And so I think an awareness as a community organization of our responsibility to take part in that conversation and ask ourselves what we can do as an organization with some modest capacity to be of service in that regard. Fantastic.
Thank you. And Megan, in the last minute, new ideas, initiatives, programs, thoughts?
Well, one of the it's an obvious one, but certainly will help our constituents is digital literacy training. And we've also had approaches from other organizations to provide that training. And given the just general social narrative right now with respect to social justice, one of the branches we're looking at is employer training. So to provide from recruitment through to onboarding and retention, how do you incorporate an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens in a meaningful way? And not just say we are open to all applicants, but what does that mean? And how are your unconscious biases preventing you from diversifying your workforce and keeping the people who are so-called diverse once you get them in the door? So that's something that we're looking to expand upon.
Fantastic. Well, we are at our time. I just want to very deeply thank all of you for being with us, for your presentations, for this conversation. I really felt like we got a deep insight into how your organizations have been responding, what you've learned, the challenges, the resilience, some of the lessons learned. So thank you all very much for sharing that with us, and hope to be able to see you again and continue this conversation in the future. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, Eric, and Megan, and of course, our very own Kevin McCaig. We're just a few minutes away from our session 2 on affordable housing, but we're going to treat you to just a few more minutes of Cape Breton musical culture. So take it away, Colin and Chrissy. Thanks again, Colin and Chrissy. So let's move on to session 2, affordable housing, which is going to be moderated by Robin Campbell. Robin is a principal of Lycan Consulting at Iqaluit, Nunavut. So take it away, Robin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your work, Catherine, and your interesting presentation. You've raised so many interesting things that we want to dive into more deeply, and I feel like there's just not going to be enough time, but a good thing because we all can continue to learn and connect and deepen what we know. So this is our Q&A session. Dear audience, you are very welcome to write your questions in the Q&A box, and I hope you know that you have the option of posting anonymously if you're feeling shy. Catherine, in the interest of time, we're going to keep your answers relatively short if possible so that we can cover more ground.
Sure.
Great. So to start, one of the things I really value about your research is that you deliver really insightful, critical housing theory. And you also articulate an array of practical steps for action that can tangibly improve people's lives. And in this presentation, you shared some really realistic policy ideas, some that we're familiar with, like including increasing income assistance rates or using community benefit agreements that bundle training and employment within new construction or even repair projects, increasing support for housing co-ops and community land trusts. Those are policy things. You've also really articulated some realistic neighborhood level ideas that can directly influence people's well-being. For example, improving the walkable proximity to necessary services like laundromats and target market rental and mobile services and food services and bottle depots and all kinds of things, all while making that access safe and accessible. So I would like to hear you speak more about about the part of your work that really looks at neighborhoods, and in particular, neighborhood distress, or that word deprivation, which is a pretty tough word. Yeah, and in particular, I'm interested in the theory of social deprivation as part of structural causes of poverty. So it appears like the work in your research, it shows that housing rentals of all sorts, both market and affordable and public housing, they're concentrated in higher material and social deprivation neighborhoods or in high social deprivation neighborhoods. So in brief, can you tell us how is this social deprivation theory developed and defined? And what do you find compelling and challenging about using deprivation theory in your work?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the second part of your question, because I think it's maybe the more important one to address. So absolutely, I have problems with these constructs of deprivation and disadvantage and distress as well. This is a first attempt at understanding the neighborhoods in which these different kinds of rental housing units are located. These measures are quantitative, and so they incorporate variables that we have in the census because that's readily available. So, the economic deprivation component of it doesn't at all include people's own perceptions and experiences of how well off they are or not. And it also doesn't capture sharing and the informal economy in these neighborhoods. So those are really important to explore. Likewise, with social deprivation, these constructs don't look at all at the kinds of supportive connections people have with their neighbors potentially, or perhaps harmful connections with their neighbors. So all of these things need to be explored using qualitative methods, in my opinion, and that's something that we're going to be doing with the partnership grant. And in doing so, I think that we can shift our framework to look at neighborhood assets and deficits, using that asset-based approach to community development that we've all talked about in 5101, rather than just looking at neighborhood disadvantage. As far as the social deprivation piece of it, I am also dissatisfied with how that is captured in this index. So it uses 3 variables in the census. It looks at, in a neighborhood, the percentage of households that are living alone, lone parent households, and also households where someone is divorced or widowed. They aren't capturing neighborhood connections at all. And so, that's a limitation with the measure. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. That it's so interesting to try and come up with tools that are comprehensive enough and grounded and rigorous enough to serve many purposes.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a terrible one either, because, with reports from BC on, who perished during the heat wave, and heat wave research that's been done in Chicago, more than 20 years ago, Quebec a few summers ago, it's people who live alone who are disproportionately impacted by those disasters. And so it's not a terrible measure, but it does require some rounding out.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. That's a good point. We've got a question from the floor, from the audience. Terry Gibbs is asking, much of the housing crisis is linked to broader structures or rules of the real estate or development market that are perfectly legal under capitalism. Will governments, both provincial and feds, be willing to change the rules? And maybe I'm going to tag team this a little bit, maybe to ask you a little more about the Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Commission work that just got released this spring.
Okay, so I'll try to answer Terry's question first. Wow, Terry, so I wish I could actually talk to you. Wish this could be a conversation and I could hear about what people think who are listening to this presentation. So will government be willing to change these rules? I don't know. I mean, my sense here in the province, in reading the Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Commission's work, is that work is quite in line with current thinking. Current government rules, like lack of regulation, for example, for short-term rentals. An unwillingness to extend tenant protections, for example, through an extension of rent control, which we have here temporarily. Do I see possibilities for change? I do. I think that, that the Housing Commission's work was countered with a report that I have to admit I co-chaired. That was the work of the Housing for All working group. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives was involved in co-chairing that as well. So that's an kind of alternative narrative and list of possibilities that we are proposing to government. We see across the country, people are talking about Housing for All. The names of the campaigns differ a little bit, but really you see the same kinds of recommendations over and over again. We need to address the financialization of housing. We need to introduce more tenant protections. We need to invest in permanently affordable, nonprofit, and public housing stock. I guess the only other thing I can say to this is that, I do see in different places governments talking about changing these rules. So there's a lot of people talking right now in the United States about actually reinvesting in public housing after decades of demolition. And I wish Justin Ellerby could say something about that, because I know he's on the call. And there are, people often look to Austria, for example, as a place where we have a lot of social housing and a willingness on the part of government to protect it and to actually build more of it. So I wish I knew, Terry.
Huge conversations, so important of this, and it's so embedded as part of CED. I guess I'm going to ask you a question that actually comes from Justin Ellerby. He talks about home share, and I know that this research in particular wasn't specifically looking at home share, but as a leader in the field, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about home sharing. If you don't want to as well, because I know it's unpacking a big beast also, but feel free.
I mean, I can address that a little bit. I mean, I'm familiar with one initiative in Canada where they're very much looking to facilitate home sharing through the development of an online platform, much like Airbnb. I absolutely think there's potential for home sharing in communities like CBRM, where you have an aging population on the one hand and big partially empty houses. And then you also have a student population looking for housing. And then you have an opportunity to address that social isolation that both of those parties may be experiencing as well. So I think absolutely it's part, it's part of the affordable housing strategy, but only very much a part of it. And I think it will work particularly well in particular kinds of markets like what we see in CBRM.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I did want to ask you a question that comes back to what you were just talking about before about public housing transformation and the redevelopment of public housing. So what are the risks and benefits of this, knowing that the Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Commission is also recommending a 2-year action to transform our housing model to account for changing demographics and client needs? Can you talk about this trend and its redevelopment also that's happening in BC and Toronto as well as in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, so I'm very concerned about public housing redevelopment. So I think that there are some benefits when we're focusing on public housing, but those benefits don't have to come from redevelopment. They can just come from us deciding that public housing is worth investing in. And so that includes repairing units, making them more accessible, and also introducing new kinds of services and amenities in these public housing neighborhoods, and also really ramping up opportunities for tenant engagement. Some jurisdictions do this better than others, but here in Nova Scotia, we have housing authorities and regional housing authorities, and they have typically 2 tenant representatives, and they're appointed, they're not elected, and that's it. They don't have tenant associations that are supported in buildings or in neighborhoods. But again, that doesn't have to come from redevelopment as such. I'm very concerned about redevelopment based on research that's been done by Martine August in Toronto, by what has happened in Vancouver with Little Mountain, where there's been a loss of units. The land was sold to a private developer, and the social housing units there were demolished immediately. After several years, finally,